G'day and welcome to another video with Better Pics. Hope this finds you all well and healthy. Today I'm going to create a video around working with and creating and editing HDR images in Adobe Camera Raw. So being able to create HDR in Adobe Camera Raw has been a feature for quite a while, even though today I'm working on the newest version of Adobe Camera Raw. It's not a new option to be able to create this type of image. Basically, for those who have not worked with or for those who do not know fully what HDR is, it stands for High Dynamic Range. So it basically means whenever you have a situation or a scene where the camera is not able to efficiently or successfully record data in all areas of the image because the difference from highlights to shadows is too big for the camera to be able to successfully record. Now, this image or this location is not too far from where I live, and it is a classic example of where HDR is a good option. As you can see, this is a waterfall in a rainforest in a cave, and it's quite a unique location and very popular with many landscape photographers and tourists alike because it is a stunning location. However, as you can see, with each of these single captures, there's no way that you can successfully record all the detail from the shadows to the highlights. This is the middle exposure, so you can see I've created 5 exposures, all different, of this scene. And you can see that the highlights are completely blown out, but the shadows are completely blocked up as well. And especially if you refer to the histogram, there's a lot of shadow blocking and a lot of highlight loss. Even with it being a raw file, it's pretty much impossible to successfully recover detail everywhere and to make it look clean. When you're pushing the shadows and the highlights that much, there is a loss of detail and a loss of quality. So as mentioned earlier, you can see I've created 5 different exposures. So the darkest allows for the highlight areas, a little bit darker there. You can see the highlights are fully captured. There's no clipping at all. Right through to the brightest exposure, which allows for capturing all the detail in the shadow areas, which you can see with this image. There's a stunning amount of detail in the ceiling and the roof of this cave, which would be a real shame to lose that detail. So certainly going through this method is a good way to go. So let's start the process, and it's really quite simple. So all we need to do is select all 5 images. So you can either use Control or Command A, or simply click Shift from one end of the images to the other, and you select all. And right click, and we would like to merge to HDR. Now the nice thing is there is a shortcut for it, which is Alt M. You know I'm a fan of my shortcuts. They certainly do help speed up your workflow, but certainly right click and merge to HDR will work just the same. Alright, bit of a status bar there just showing the process. These aren't massive files, they're off a old 5D Mark III, so about I think 21 megapixels from memory. And obviously all shot in RAW, and there we go. Now there's a couple of options here which are definitely worth looking at. So options are to align images, apply auto settings, which I don't generally go for because I'm gonna have every intention to edit the image afterwards. Now deghost is a little bit interesting. You've got a few options there: off, low, medium and high. Deghost is when you have anything in the frame that's potentially moving that might create some sort of ghosting effect and affect, I guess, the quality or sharpness of the image. So a classic example of this is if you take a long exposure, nighttime or low light exposure of, say, a marina where you've got yachts and masts moving and that sort of thing. Quite a strong potential there to have some ghosting. So the deghosting is just there to use in case you need to. Obviously the best setting to go for is dependent on the image and dependent on the results that you want and the results you get. Alright, so definitely handy to have there. So what we're going to do now is just click merge. So it's going to prompt you to save the created DNG. So it does actually create another file for you to work with, very similar to merging to a panorama, where it does create a new panorama DNG file. So I'm just going to pop it in the my raw folder, which is fine. And you'll see that extra file has appeared down the bottom, and we're good to go. Now you may notice, rightly so, that the image looks no different to one of the other exposures. It doesn't look like a HDR at all. But what it actually does is it allows the flexibility of retaining or editing back in the highlight and shadow details by drawing on those other exposures that are best suited for that area of the image. For example, if we look at this exposure, for example, which is probably the closest, actually it's, yep. If we try to retain the highlights, let's go all the way down and boost up the shadows, you can see that it's incredibly noisy in the shadow areas and the highlights have still been clipped. So even though we are able to boost the shadows and get detail there, and we are able to recover a lot of the highlights it's still not perfect. Whereas if we work on the merged image and we pull our highlights back, you can see that the quality of the highlights and the quality of the shadows is much, much better. Now, where we're going to see that is if we zoom right in, you can see that there's full detail in the highlight areas. Now, I'm editing this a bit to the extreme, and there's full clean detail in the shadows, which, as many of you would know, when you push your shadows heavily, you will always end up with an extremely noisy image. So you can see that just by using those two sliders on this new merged HDR image at the bottom there, you can see that we absolutely are able to push this file much further, which with much better detail in all areas, and the image looks clean. We've retained all data from highlights to shadows, and we've got a lot more flexibility in our edit, which is fantastic. Now, if we compare this HDR image that's made up of several other exposures to the image that we tried to recover, I'm just going to make that a little bit brighter so that it matches. You can see, if we go into 200%, the amount of noise that you get in the shadow areas. It's not very clean at all. Whereas if we go over to our HDR image, you can see that that shadow area is completely clean in comparison. So there's really no doubt that in this sort of scenario where you have such a high contrast image, merging several different exposures is definitely the way to go and will render results far cleaner than a single exposure. Of course, in this situation, it's always best to use a tripod so that your images are perfectly aligned. Super important and well worth considering carrying one for moments like this. As with any edit, you're able to continue working on with the DNG with all of that flexibility of RAW, but obviously with all of the flexibility of drawing upon those various exposures that make up this single HDR image to have fully recovered highlights and beautiful clean shadows, which in this scenario, as you can see, or as you saw with the original file, it's an extremely high contrast situation and very, very difficult to work with as a single frame. It's not too often that I shoot HDR images, but when you can, it's well worth it because the control and results that you have are far, far better than trying to create a usable image from a single frame. From here, I would go through my normal process of editing and enjoy all the benefits of that raw workflow with the various exposures to call upon, and hopefully at the end of it get a really good result. Certainly looking good to start with. Thanks again for stopping by. Hope this video has been helpful, and as always, please be sure to leave any questions or comments in the comments below, and look forward to seeing you stop by next time. Thanks again and take care.